Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Brian. I am accompanied here by Carolina and Jasmin, and we are here to present our two-pronged approach to solving sustainability in Indonesia, and we will be presenting as the Ministry of Agriculture.
The outstanding issue is that corporations and smallholders are not held accountable, and there are no incentives to reach sustainable measures in place already.
So we wanted to address the sustainability problem with a two-pronged approach, which would hold the major players in the palm oil industry, being the big corporations and small farmers, hold them accountable to meet sustainability goals, but at a realistic and sustainable level.
Our first objective is to create a solution for the smallholders. We'll start by defining a smallholder. According to the RSPO, a smallholder is a farmer growing oil palms where the total planted area for oil palms is below 500 hectares. To do this, we will start by addressing the barriers to sustainability. First, there is a barrier in the access to finance. Smallholders don't have access to resources that allow them to farm sustainably. And this goes hand in hand with the barrier in the access to input. Since these smallholders don't have the disposable income to spend on input, such as seeds and farming tools, it's difficult for them to be pushed towards sustainability and reach sustainable goals. Our last barrier is the cultural barrier that exists between smallholders and financial institutions.
All right, and so through these, we acknowledge these barriers, and then what we want to create is an agriculture extension program that connects these three barriers in a way where we allow them access to finance inputs and address the cultural issues. And so what we thought of is Islamic microfinancing, because if we look at the demographic in Indonesia, the overwhelming majority of individuals there are Muslims. And so what we would do is we would tailor these loans, garner support from the World Banks so that they can tailor loans to these farmers so that we have longer grace periods for them because of the seasons and the harvest. And this will create a collaboration with banks so that we are able to bring people together, trust our banks and our process, because we are looking through this in their view and not through a Western lens.
Okay, so what we need the microcredit loans for, what the cost would be covering, would include training on training, labor. We would have certain people from the coordinating minister for economic affairs that would actually train local or important local community leaders and agricultural leaders on sustainable and modern practices in farming, which would also increase sustainability, but also address the problem of productivity and the harvest yield. So it would increase everything and also address sustainability. We would also provide the cost for the input for harvest. So that would be including the seeds, the fertilizer, and the different types of technology needed. And then a big part of this program is actually investing in biomass fuel. So even though we're not addressing the palm oil itself and its implications on the environment, we're providing a way to alleviate the actual environmental consequences by converting it into biomass fuel through the process of gasifying, for example, the oil shells and the empty fruit bunches. And it's actually an environmental friendly alternative. So we wanted to acknowledge the pros and cons of this first approach environmentally. Pros would include implementing sustainable farming methods, helping biodiversity grow, and then we are also addressing the fossil fuel dependency in Indonesia with alternative fuel.
All right, and then another benefit is we are able to lift farmers out of poverty by giving them funds, making it easier for them to enter the market.
And positive social outcomes include an investment in communities and a higher family income.
And then cons for environmental-wise of environmental lens would be, although we're not offering an alternative solution to the palm oil itself, we're offering ways to alleviate the negative consequences environmentally.
And we also thought of the effects of a bad harvest. And so what we thought of is having this policy to help alleviate the impact of it. And then also we considered the cultural hesitance, and that is why we are taking the Islamic microfinancing, so that we are designing this solution for them. And so then we define corporations, which the RSPO defines as growers of palm oil where total land area managed for oil palm cultivation is more than 500 hectares. And so then we look at their barriers, and we acknowledge that there is a lack of accountability, there are unmet regulations, and there seems to be no incentives to want to be sustainable.
So part of this second approach is requiring these corporations to do certain reporting, which would include how much sustainable land is actually implemented into their plantations. Are they meeting RSPO requirements, including their market data and labor practices, such as are they addressing child labor, other concerns there. And it's all about improving transparency and making this data more accessible to the public.
Yeah, so our first outcome focuses on corporations who have failed to have positive reporting. These corporations will be required to pay a fine, which will go towards a land restoration fund. And this will be supervised by the coordinating Minister of Economic Affairs. The funds will then be allocated directly to local and indigenous communities who have been affected by unsustainable practices, and will get the input of these communities to see what they need specifically. And corporations that have positive reporting will be given a tax break for evidence of workplace equity and sustainability within the corporation and within their business. Next, we'll move on to the pros and cons of this approach. Environmentally, indigenous and community land restoration would allow for more biodiversity, and mandatory reporting would allow for transparent sustainability data for government and public use in the future for research and other methods.
Yeah, and then we're also addressing the reason why the RSPO is not working. They have really good assessments on what sustainable means in Indonesia, but there's no measures to actually enforce it or implement it. So we are providing incentives, but also properly enforcing it that will actually benefit corporation and smallholders.
And socially, there would be an improvement in community life and access to natural food sources, as well as improved labor conditions for those working in big corporations.
A quick con that we noticed was as sustainability increases, there's a decrease in funding, which could change the standard of living in local and indigenous communities, but we would find ways for local restorations and for indigenous communities to not become dependent on the fund. And so then we go into a budget, and we consider 20 million because it seemed feasible from their budget plan of 2019. And so we would allocate most of the funds to the smallholders, because the smallholders, their barrier is the finance, the money. So they're lacking in funding. And so we would break it down to 30, 20, 50 split, where biomass, because it is has the highest cost, we would allocate most of the funds there, and then break it up between training and banking. Training would get the least because there's already somewhat of a legislation in place that could help reduce these costs. And the large holders, we would allocate the 30% of the 20 million, which would take into account tax breaks and the implementation of policy, which would account for logistics and payroll.
Also, another thing I wanted to mention is that we found that there was actually already legislation in place that was actually encouraging businesses to implement biomass energy initiatives. So this actually may be reduced. And so in conclusion, we just wanted to connect the two prongs of our legislation approach. We wanted to address we call them our pillars. And so each prong is addressing collectively. This approach doesn't work if the smallholders and corporations don't work together. So ultimately, the positive effects it would have would be education and training for farmers on sustainability, and also more modern practices that could increase productivity and yield. We're also addressing cultural barriers that make previous legislation difficult. We're making sustainable farming normal. We're normalizing it. We're improving conditions for smallholder farmers and giving them more autonomy, providing collateral for financing, which would be sort of the risk mitigations by the larger development banks. We're providing input for seeds and technology and mechanization services, improving relationships between smallholder farmers and processors, and creating a more comprehensive value chain with the addition of the biomass fuel energy sector.
Okay, thank you guys. That is your 10 minutes. Great job. And now we have 5 minutes for the judges to ask you any questions that they may have about your presentation. I'm going to start that time now.
Thanks for your presentation. Can you clarify what you would do in your scope of work? What would you do as the government versus where would you, try and set up a public-private partnership or a partnership with an NGO? The microfinance institution, the education components, biomass plant, other components. Yeah.
So the government part, a lot of it has to be initiated by the government and not really so much NGOs, just because, like, for example, the Ministry of Agriculture has more influence and more power to actually enforce these certain policies. We think that, like, for example, our microcredit loans won't work unless it's implemented by the government, because we're trying to address that cultural barrier. It's according to our research, it's actually taboo to for especially Muslim people to acquire certain loans with interest rates. So that's not something that we could kind of impose on another entity. That's something that the Indonesian government would have to kind of spearhead. So that's kind of, I guess, that's the answer.
And the biomass plant, similarly, that would be just a government project.
Yes.
Thank you.
So actually, Indonesia is one of the pioneers in microfinance. So instead of creating a new, specifically for the palm oil industry, would you have considered using existing microfinance institutions to as your project?
So we did look into that, and we also saw that I think by the year 2020 they were trying to make 1/6 of all institutions Islamic. And so what we thought was, if we did it on a grand scale, it wouldn't we felt as though it wouldn't benefit the specific market, because we were trying to tackle the palm oil industry. And so this also creates more incentives for collective action within those communities and within that industry.
There's also there with certain banks, for example, the local central banks being an intermediary, we thought would be more difficult to implement, because there are more risks to giving loans out to smallholders, farmers who a lot work on farming, like subsistence farming. So that was kind of our idea behind addressing like that cultural barrier. So yes, it is something that we have considered, but we also wanted to address hesitancies that may come from those local communities.
You had mentioned your budget for the project. Is that for overall looking forward into the future, or is there going to be additional costs as you move down the road, and where will you primarily retrieve that money from?
Yeah, so the budget allocated or shown at the moment is for the first year. And so we see some of the costs, so like tax breaks, as we see people being incentivized we could see that increasing later down the road as people become more, as sustainability becomes the normal. That's what we're looking to promote. And so with that, we could see that increasing, but I think everything else, there would be a decrease because as, there wouldn't be as much of a risk in the training, in the banking, as it becomes normalized, the risk would fall. And so costs would probably decrease in the budget, and we could spend probably we could allocate it in different amounts as we go through.
Okay, thank you guys. That's your 5 minutes for questions. Thank you so much for your presentation and great work.
Thank you so much. Have a nice day.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Okay, I think great.